Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. Lieutenant Commander Nathan Reed of the Terran Expeditionary Force stood at the edge of the spacecraft hangar, eyes fixed on the sleek transport vessel before him. The Zorvian-class transport, a well-tested workhorse of the fleet, looked deceptively simple compared to the advanced warships he was accustomed to commanding. But this mission wasn't about firepower or strategy. It was about one thing and one thing only: delivering a high-value, dangerous alien prisoner to the remote outpost on Zarthos 4. Nathan had never signed up for this kind of duty. He was an experienced officer, a soldier forged in the crucible of countless skirmishes across human-colonized space. But today the higher-ups had given him an assignment that made his skin crawl: transporting the young alien woman HFY. HFY was a member of the Zephyrians, a species whose towering violet-skinned warriors had been enemies of humanity for years. Their eyes glowed like the light of a distant star, and their telepathic abilities were well documented in every fleet intelligence report. She was a prisoner of war, captured during a recent border conflict, and the Terran High Command had decided she would be transported to the distant penal colony of Zarthos 4 for interrogation and containment. Nathan's mission was clear: get her there no matter what. The problem was that HFY hated humans. Not just a casual dislike, she despised them with every fiber of her being. Nathan had seen the reports. She'd nearly killed 2 guards during the initial transport from the battlefield, and her escape attempts were legendary. Some had even whispered that she was more dangerous than any Terran combatant. Still, orders were orders, and Nathan was the one who had been assigned to this task. He had been told that he would be the one to handle her transportation personally. No other officer had been considered suitable for this mission, no matter their rank or experience. Nathan didn't know if that was a sign of his competence or a deliberate attempt to make him miserable. He shook his head, pushing those thoughts aside. He had to finish this if he wanted to stay in the fleet. And finish it without any major incidents. The doors to the shuttle opened, and Nathan's fingers tightened around the straps of his uniform as he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, but he could make out the figure chained to the far wall. HFY was exactly as the intelligence reports had described her: tall, with skin the color of midnight and eyes that glowed like molten stars. She glared at him as though daring him to approach. Her chains, made of a rare metal found only on the inhospitable moon of Vrelos, had been designed specifically to dampen her telepathic powers. But Nathan knew she was still dangerous. She wasn't looking at him now, though. Her eyes were locked on the far wall, her nostrils flaring with barely contained rage. She was, in essence, a caged beast, and Nathan had no illusions about what would happen if she was ever free again. Without a word, Nathan moved to his seat at the control panel. He keyed in the coordinates for the next leg of the journey, trying to ignore the electric tension in the air. The shuttle hummed to life, and the gravitational dampeners kicked in as they lifted off. For several minutes, there was nothing but the low hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of his breath. He kept his eyes on the navigation display, knowing that the slightest misstep would set HFY off. If the stories were true, she could break free of her chains and disable the entire shuttle with nothing but her mind. He was about to shift his focus when the quiet was shattered by her voice, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're no different from the others," she said, her words tinged with bitterness. Her voice was smooth and cold, but there was a tremor of raw emotion just beneath the surface. "You think you can break me? You think you can tame me like some docile creature? You don't understand what you're dealing with?" Nathan didn't respond at first. He couldn't afford to. He knew better than to engage with her, especially now. But there was something about the venom in her voice that gnawed at him, a quiet challenge he couldn't ignore. He glanced at her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "I'm not here to break you," he said, his voice firm but measured. "I'm here to get you to your destination." Her lips curled into a sneer. "My destination? Do you think you control my fate, human? You're a fool." Nathan exhaled sharply and turned back to the controls. He didn't have the energy to argue with her. As much as he wanted to refute her claims, he knew this was a battle he couldn't win. The hours passed in uncomfortable silence. HFY had stopped speaking, but Nathan could feel her eyes boring into him from across the shuttle. He didn't dare look up again. It wasn't long before the ship entered a region of space known for its dense asteroid fields. Nathan kept a steady hand on the controls, navigating the ship through the maze of floating rocks. The last thing he needed was to be caught in a collision with any of them, especially while carrying a prisoner as dangerous as HFY. Suddenly, the shuttle's alarms blared, breaking his concentration. Nathan's heart skipped a beat as the ship lurched violently to the side. The asteroid field wasn't supposed to be this dense. Something was wrong. Before he could react, the shuttle was rocked again. This time, the systems went dark, and the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air. A direct hit. The ship was damaged. What the hell? Nathan muttered, his fingers flying across the console as he struggled to regain control. The flashing warning lights made his head spin, but he couldn't afford to panic. He was still in charge. But just as he thought he had the situation under control, he heard a sound from behind him. Something soft, almost inaudible at first. "I told you, human," Ishire's voice floated across the cabin, laced with a cold promise. "You can't tame what was never meant to be controlled." Nathan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The shuttle was no longer just a simple transport. It had become the battlefield for a struggle he hadn't anticipated. The struggle of survival in the most unpredictable of circumstances. Nathan's hands flew over the damaged controls, his mind racing as the ship rocked again. The asteroid field had suddenly grown denser, and whatever had caused the initial hit had left the shuttle vulnerable. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, not with Ishire on board. Warning: critical damage to the propulsion system. Power loss detected. Emergency systems activated, the synthetic voice echoed through the cabin. "Damn it," Nathan muttered, gripping the console as another violent jolt threw him against his seat. Ishire's laughter, cold and mirthless, rang out behind him. "It's too late, human. Your precious ship is doomed, and so are you." Nathan cursed under his breath, trying to steady the shuttle. His eyes flicked over the malfunctioning readouts, but they offered no easy solutions. He was skilled at ship operations, but this wasn't a routine systems failure, it was a full-scale crisis. There was no time to waste. "Shut up, Ishire," Nathan snapped, focusing on recalibrating the course to avoid a collision. "This isn't over yet." He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't dare look back. With every passing moment, the shuttle's damage worsened. He needed to act fast, or they would both be dead. Ishire's voice came again, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was colder and more calculating. "You don't understand, do you? There's no escape. No survival for either of us." Nathan ground his teeth together, trying to block out her words. He couldn't let her get inside his head. But he knew she was right about one thing: the shuttle was severely damaged. Without working thrusters or shields, their fate seemed sealed. Suddenly, a piercing whine filled the cabin as the emergency alarms blared. The forward viewport cracked, throwing shards of glass into the cockpit. Nathan cursed as he ducked, narrowly avoiding the shards. Blood from his hand dripped onto the control panel, mixing with the broken glass. But he couldn't afford to be distracted. He worked quickly, inputting commands into the manual override system. If they didn't make it out of the asteroid field soon, the entire ship would break apart. But the rock-strewn void was endless, and they seemed to be caught in the middle of it. Another violent jolt rocked the shuttle, and this time, it threw Nathan out of his seat. His head collided with the bulkhead, sending a wave of nausea through his body. He groaned, pushing himself to his feet, and quickly regained his place at the controls. He wasn't about to die like this. "You're not going to survive this," Ishire's voice cut through the noise, chillingly calm. "Not unless you listen to me." Nathan's vision blurred slightly as blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. He wiped it away, determined not to show weakness. But as he looked at the desperate state of the shuttle, a grim realization began to settle in his mind. Ishire's telepathic powers had been dampened by her restraints, but that didn't mean she was helpless. Her species was known for their cunning intelligence, their ability to survive in the harshest conditions, and most importantly for their adaptability. She had to have a plan. And right now he had no choice but to hear her out. He gritted his teeth, his fingers trembling on the controls. "Fine. What do you want?" A silence stretched between them. Then Ishire spoke again, but this time her voice had changed. It was no longer the mocking tone of an enemy. There was something different in it, almost strategic. "I can fix your ship," she said slowly. "If you let me." Nathan blinked, disoriented by the suggestion. "What? Why would I?" "You're running out of options, human," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "You need to trust me or we both die here. I can make the repairs you need to survive. But only if you let me." Nathan's pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Trust her? A Zephyrian warrior who hated humans, who had killed countless soldiers in the past. Trusting her was madness. But as the shuttle careened through the asteroid field, its damaged systems failing by the second, he realized he didn't have a choice. Why would you help me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Because I'm not an idiot, HFY replied. I survive because I adapt. And right now, I need you alive just as much as you need me. If you die, I'm stuck here just as dead as you. Nathan hesitated, weighing the words. He knew he was in no position to argue, especially with her sharp intelligence. She might have hated humans, but survival was a common instinct. Perhaps there was something in that, something he could use. All right, he said, barely above a whisper. Do it. But if you double-cross me? I don't do anything half-heartedly, she cut in. You'll have your chance to make me pay for it later. But right now, I'm your only hope. With that, Nathan opened the restraints on HFY's shackles, wary of any sudden movements. She gave him a cold, measured look but did not resist. Her hands, though bound by the metal cuffs, moved fluidly as she crouched by the control panel, her alien grace apparent even in the confined space. HFY's fingers flew over the broken systems with an ease Nathan couldn't help but admire. Her telepathic abilities may have been dampened, but her technical skills were still formidable. She worked quickly, bypassing security protocols and fixing the primary power grid in a matter of minutes. Nathan watched in awe, unable to hide his surprise. She was smart, faster than any engineer he had worked with in his career. Her species, it seemed, wasn't just about physical strength. They had other, more subtle weapons in their arsenal. You're making repairs, Nathan muttered, more to himself than to her. But why should I believe you'll fix everything? HFY didn't look up from the control panel, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. A hint of pride? A glimmer of something softer? Because, she said, her tone low and controlled, I don't lose. And I'm not going to let this ship fall to a bunch of rocks. Not when I have the chance to escape. You'll see. Nathan narrowed his eyes, unsure of her true intentions. But the fact remained, the shuttle was still drifting perilously through the asteroid field, and without her, they were dead. He had no choice but to trust her, for now. And maybe, just maybe, this unexpected alliance could be the key to both their survival. The ship jolted again, but this time it was a gentler way. One by one, the warning lights on the control panel flickered out, and a new hum began to vibrate through the walls. The ship was coming back online. Nathan leaned back in his seat, his breath shaky as he allowed himself a moment of relief. HFY had done it. The repairs were working. But as his pulse slowed, a nagging feeling grew at the back of his mind. Trusting her might have saved them both, but it could also be the beginning of a far more complicated game. Keep your end of the bargain, HFY, he muttered, half to himself, half to the alien woman who now stood beside him. I won't forget this. HFY looked at him, her violet eyes cold but calculating. Don't worry, human. I'm not one to forget either. The shuttle had stabilized, but the damage was far from repaired. The hum of the engines had returned to a low but steady rhythm, and the asteroids that had been threatening to tear the ship apart were now a distant memory, floating harmlessly in the rearview. Nathan sat in the cockpit, watching the dark void of space unfold before him, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on HFY. She had fixed the shuttle with unnerving precision. But trust didn't come easy for him, especially not when it came to an alien who had made it clear she would rather see humanity burn than aid it. He couldn't help but feel like he was walking a razor-thin line between survival and betrayal. You did well, Nathan said, breaking the silence that had settled over them after her repairs. His voice was dry, but there was a flicker of reluctant admiration in his words. HFY didn't respond immediately. She sat across from him, her arms crossed, eyes glowing faintly as they stared out into space. She had gone back to being the cold, aloof prisoner she had been before the emergency. Even after everything that had just happened, she seemed unfazed, almost like she didn't care. You think I did this out of the goodness of my heart? She finally spoke, her voice as smooth as ever. There was no hint of gratitude in her tone, just the same cutting edge of contempt. You're a fool if you believe that. Nathan exhaled, leaning back in his seat, and running a hand through his disheveled hair. He could feel the weariness in his bones. The adrenaline from the crisis had long since worn off, replaced by a heavy, gnawing fatigue that told him just how close he had come to death. And how close he still was. I'm not expecting charity, HFY, he said, his voice steady. But if I'm going to make it out of this, I need to know where you stand. You're right, this isn't about kindness. But it's not about letting us both die either. So what's your play? HFY's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. I have no play, human. I'm doing what I need to do to survive. That's all. Nathan studied her, his mind racing. She wasn't just talking about survival in the immediate sense. There was something else, something beneath the surface that was driving her actions. The question was what? What happens when we get to Zarthos 4? Nathan pressed. You'll be a prisoner again. Will you try to escape then? Will I be your next target? Ishiray shifted slightly, her violet eyes locking onto his, and for the briefest moment, Nathan saw something flicker within them. It wasn't hate. It wasn't rage. It was something else, something darker. Do you think you'll survive there, human? She asked, her voice suddenly low and cold. Zarthos 4 is not a place you want to end up. It's not a prison. It's a graveyard. Nathan felt his stomach drop. He had heard rumors about Zarthos 4, about how the colony was a place for the most dangerous and hostile prisoners of war. It was an isolated, desolate place and many who went there never came back. The thought of being sent there was enough to send a shiver down his spine, but he had never considered it would be a death sentence. If I get you there, Nathan said, swallowing hard, you won't get the chance to do anything. You'll be locked up. Ishiray raised an eyebrow, her lips pulling into a faint, calculating smile. You don't understand. You don't control what happens to me. Not there. Not anywhere. Nathan clenched his jaw. She wasn't wrong. He had no illusions that the Zephyrians, especially someone like Ishiray, would ever be bound by the same rules that govern human behavior. But he still had a mission and he still had a duty to see it through. You're right, he said, voice tight. I don't control anything. But that doesn't change the fact that you're coming with me. You don't have a choice. Ishiray's eyes darkened, but she said nothing. She turned back toward the viewport, staring out into the endless expanse of space. Nathan, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had repaired the ship, yes, but there had been no sign of remorse or even any sense of gratitude. It was as if she viewed this entire ordeal as an inconvenience that for now she would tolerate. But for how long? He had no answers, but one thing was certain. Ishiray's attitude was dangerous. She was more than just a prisoner. She was a force to be reckoned with. And somehow, despite everything, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that their fates were intertwined in a way neither of them understood yet. The next few hours were uneventful. Ishiray remained silent for the most part, her sharp eyes scanning every inch of the shuttle as though searching for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities. Nathan, on the other hand, remained at the controls, glancing occasionally at the diagnostics to make sure the ship wasn't about to fall apart again. It wasn't until they crossed into the outer fringes of Zarthos IV's orbit that Ishiray spoke again. This time, her voice had an edge of something more serious, more dangerous. We're not alone, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the view screen ahead. Nathan's hand hovered over the control panel, eyes narrowing as he studied the readings. There was nothing on the radar. No signatures and no ships in range. I don't see anything, Nathan replied, tension creeping into his voice. What are you talking about? Ishiray didn't look at him. There's something out there, she said, her voice unwavering. It's watching us. Nathan's pulse quickened. He didn't like the sound of that, especially not with Zarthos 4 just ahead. His mind raced as he ran through the possibilities. Pirates, hostile alien forces, another Zephyrian fleet? They had to have come from somewhere. And if they were watching, they could strike at any moment. He reached for the weapons control, checking the ship's armament. Not much, just basic defensive systems meant to discourage raiders. He didn't think it would be enough if they were truly under attack. Are you sure? Nathan asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. I don't make mistakes, she replied coldly, her eyes never leaving the viewport. Suddenly the ship jolted once more. This time it wasn't the impact of rocks. This felt deliberate. I told you, Ishiray said, her voice icy as if she'd been expecting this all along. You should have listened to me. Now we're both in danger. Nathan's heart thudded in his chest as the comms crackled to life. The message was distorted, faint, but unmistakable. Human vessel, a voice growled over the static, you have entered restricted space. Prepare for boarding. Before Nathan could react, the shuttle's systems flickered and died. The lights went out, and the sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hull. A voice, dark and calm, whispered in Nathan's ear, and Ishiray's cold eyes met his, a quiet understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about surviving Zarthos 4 anymore. This was a fight for something much bigger. The shuttle shook again, more violently this time. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. Nathan's fingers flew over the dead control panel, but nothing responded. No emergency lights. No power. The hum of the engines had ceased, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence that weighed heavily in the air. Ishiray's voice broke through the stillness, her tone as sharp and calculating as ever. They're not just going to board us, human. They'll tear us apart first. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest. Whoever they were, they had far more firepower than his damaged shuttle could handle. His fingers tightened into fists as he scanned the blank displays before him. There was nothing to work with, no way to even send a distress signal. Who are they? Nathan asked, keeping his voice steady despite the rising panic. His eyes flicked to HFY. What's happening? HFY looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim cockpit. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, a flicker of recognition, perhaps a touch of concern. I told you before, she said, her voice low. We're not alone in this sector. The people chasing us are not just pirates. They're mercenaries, part of a faction that controls this part of space. And they don't like visitors. You're in their way now, human. Nathan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had no idea who these mercenaries were or what they wanted, but they had the upper hand. If they were part of a larger faction, it meant they were connected to a network of power. They weren't just some random rogue group, they were organized. Deadly. Before he could respond, the comms crackled to life again, this time much clearer. Human vessel, you are under our control. Prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be futile. The cold, metallic voice sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the seat, willing himself to think. He had to stay calm. They were going to board, but there had to be a way out. What do we do? He asked HFY, his voice clipped. HFY's lips curled into a wry smile, but it wasn't a pleasant one. First, you stop panicking. Nathan shot her a glare, but she wasn't wrong. His heart was still racing, but his mind had begun to work faster now. He had to figure out their options, and fast. These mercenaries would give them no mercy. He did not doubt that. What do you know about them? He asked. What kind of weapons are we dealing with? Far more than you have, HFY answered, her eyes narrowing. And far more dangerous. But you're not completely helpless. I can help you if you're willing to listen. Nathan didn't hesitate. I'm listening. HFY moved swiftly toward the cockpit's rear access, her long limbs moving with fluid grace. She seemed calm, almost unnervingly so, as she bent down and began pulling open a hidden compartment. A moment later, she revealed a set of strange, sleek-looking weapons that Nathan couldn't identify at first glance. What are those? Nathan asked, his curiosity piqued despite the rising tension. Shields, HFY said, tossing him one of the devices. They'll buy us a few seconds when they board. Long enough for you to act. But they won't last long. Nathan caught the shield in his hand, examining the compact, cylindrical device. It hummed faintly in his grip, its surface smooth and metallic. It was clearly designed to absorb and deflect incoming projectiles. The kind of projectiles the mercenaries would likely use. He didn't hesitate. If this was their only chance of surviving, he would take it. Any other surprises? He asked, barely looking up as he attached the shield to his arm. HFY's eyes glinted in the dim light. You're the surprise, human. You're the one they didn't expect. Nathan furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Before she could respond, the shuttle lurched forward violently, the hull shuddering as something large and heavy impacted against the outer frame. The sound of metal grinding against metal was deafening, and the entire shuttle seemed to shake as though it were being pulled apart. I think they've arrived, HFY said, her voice tinged with something like amusement. Nathan's pulse quickened. It was no longer a question of whether they were under attack. The mercenaries had boarded, and they had done it quickly. He could almost feel them closing in, their presence pressing down on the ship like a physical weight. Get ready, Nathan said, checking the remaining weapons HFY had given him. His hands were shaking now, but he didn't let it show. He had been through worse. Much worse. They had mere moments. The shuttle's door suddenly slammed open with a force that nearly sent Nathan stumbling backward. A group of men, mercenaries dressed in dark, armored suits, stormed into the cockpit. They were heavily armed, their weapons glinting in the dim light, and their faces were masked, save for the eyes that glowed with an unsettling alien-like gleam. Nathan's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't hesitate. He raised the shield, and a pulse of energy burst from it just as the first mercenary fired. The blast ricocheted harmlessly off the shield, and Nathan moved swiftly, firing back with one of the energy pistols HFY had handed him. A shot rang out, hitting one of the mercenaries square in the chest, and he collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. The others didn't falter. They advanced, pushing forward with unnerving precision. Hold them off. HFY shouted from behind him, her voice a command, but it wasn't panic. There was no panic in her at all. She moved to the control panel, working quickly. Nathan could feel the heat of the battle rising around him, but he focused on the mercenaries in front of him, using the shield to block their shots and returning fire when he saw an opening. The sound of gunfire and the hum of energy blasts filled the air. The mercenaries were ruthless, trained killers. But Nathan was no slouch either. His training had prepared him for moments like this. Even if it wasn't the mission he signed up for, he would fight like hell to survive. "I need more time," Ishirai yelled, her fingers flying over the console, trying to access the shuttle's remaining systems. A blast hit Nathan's shoulder, sending him staggering backward. The shield absorbed most of the impact, but the shockwave still made his vision swim. He gritted his teeth, refusing to go down like this. He fired again, striking another mercenary square in the chest, sending him crumpling to the floor. But there were more, always more. The shield began to flicker, its energy reserves draining rapidly. Nathan's heart raced. How long could it hold? Ishirai's voice broke through the chaos again. "You're running out of time?" Nathan glanced at her, then back at the mercenaries. Their leader, a hulking figure in black armor, stepped forward, raising his weapon, a massive rifle aimed directly at Nathan. In that split second, time seemed to slow. Nathan knew what was coming. This was the moment he would either live or die. Ishirai's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Then, without warning, she acted. She pressed a single button on the control panel, and the shuttle's engines roared to life once again. The mercenaries turned in confusion as the ship lurched forward, throwing them off balance. Nathan took the opportunity. With the last of his strength, he threw himself toward the leader, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing into the mercenaries behind him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Get to the escape pods," Nathan shouted, his voice hoarse. Ishirai's cold eyes met his and she nodded. She wasn't a warrior for nothing. The shuttle shook violently as Nathan struggled to regain his footing. The mercenaries, thrown off balance by the sudden lurch of the ship, scrambled to stabilize themselves, but the moment of disarray wasn't going to last long. They were far too well trained, and the shock of being attacked was quickly turning into focused rage. Their leader, still recovering from Nathan's desperate tackle, was already raising his weapon again, intent on finishing the job. Ishirai was already at the rear of the cockpit, fingers flying across a hidden panel near the emergency exit. Nathan had no idea what she was doing, but if it was something that would get them out of there, he wouldn't question it. "Go," she shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. "Now?" He barely had time to think before she activated the emergency thrusters. The shuttle lurched again, this time with an intense forward acceleration. The mercenaries at the front of the cockpit barely had time to react as the ship shot forward, plummeting toward the exit, towards the empty void of space beyond. "Escape pods," Nathan muttered under his breath, finally understanding her plan. Ishirai had overridden the shuttle's systems and engaged the escape pod launch. It was the only chance they had to survive. Nathan grabbed for the nearest pod release lever, his heart pounding. The mercenaries were still recovering, but they wouldn't be for long. They had no time. "Stay close," he ordered, before pulling the lever to launch one of the escape pods. The pod ejected with a violent jolt, and Nathan felt his stomach churn as the shuttle's structure seemed to tear itself apart around them. He could hear the sound of metal groaning, the hull creaking under the pressure. They had to get clear. Inside the escape pod, the small space was dimly lit, the air thick with the sound of Nathan's heavy breathing. He quickly activated the pod's communication system, sending out a distress signal. There was no guarantee it would get through, but it was their best shot. His hands trembled slightly as he input the emergency codes into the system. Ishirai was standing beside him, a silent presence, her gaze locked on the view screen. Her eyes seemed distant, calculating, as though she were already planning their next move. Nathan couldn't help but wonder just how much of this was part of her design. "What now?" Nathan asked, his voice sharp with impatience. The escape pod was far from a haven. It was a temporary solution. They needed to escape, to find a way to evade the mercenaries, or at least call for reinforcements. Ishirai didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over at him, her face unreadable. "You think we're safe in this?" she said, her voice cold, devoid of emotion. "We're in the same danger. They'll track us. This pod won't make it far. If we don't deal with them." Nathan gritted his teeth, but there was no denying the truth in her words. The escape pod was a temporary measure at best. The mercenaries would have traced their escape by now. They wouldn't be safe for long. But what choice did they have? "We fight," Nathan said grimly, his jaw clenched. "That's the only way we get out of this alive." Ishirai studied him for a moment, as though weighing the truth of his statement. She opened her mouth to respond, but the comms crackled to life again, cutting her off. Human escape pod detected. Prepare to be boarded. The voice was distorted, but Nathan could hear the unmistakable satisfaction in the tone. They had tracked them down. It wouldn't be long now before the mercenaries closed in. Nathan's hands were shaking as he gripped the console. We don't have time to wait for them to board. We have to fight back now. HFY moved quickly, opening another hidden compartment within the pod. This one was even smaller than the previous one, but inside were weapons. Advanced, sleek-looking energy rifles designed for close combat. She passed one to Nathan, and he barely had time to register the weapon's design before she activated the pod's weapon systems. Once we're in range, we hit them hard, she said, her voice still calm. These weapons will buy us a few minutes. Nathan's grip on the rifle tightened, but his mind was racing. A few minutes? It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the console. Nathan's stomach tightened. The mercenaries had caught up faster than he anticipated. They were closing in. I can't hold them off forever, HFY said, her voice laced with urgency. We need to get closer. Just a little closer. Nathan didn't need to ask what she meant. He understood all too well. The only way they had a chance was if they could use the escape pod's small, maneuverable size to their advantage. They would have to get up close to the mercenary ship and hit them before they were boarded themselves. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, Nathan barked, pulling the pod into a sharp, spiraling turn as the mercenary ship loomed larger on the view screen. The pod groaned under the strain, but Nathan pushed the controls to their limit, twisting and turning to avoid the enemy's fire. Focus, HFY snapped, her hand on the targeting controls. We can't avoid them forever. Get close enough to strike. Nathan cursed under his breath as the mercenary ship fired a warning shot. It skimmed past the pod, missing by inches, but the force of it sent the escape pod into a wild spin. The cabin was thrown into disarray, and Nathan struggled to regain control. This is going to get us killed, Nathan shouted, fighting to stabilize the pod. But HFY's calm demeanor never faltered. She was locked into the moment, her eyes fixed on the mercenary ship as though it were her only focus in the universe. Keep going, she commanded. I have an idea. The pod rocked again, but this time it was different. Instead of the sharp, sudden impact of enemy fire, the entire pod lurched as if some unseen force had tugged it backward. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a close pass. He looked over at HFY, her eyes narrowing, her expression unreadable. And then, in a flash, the realization hit him. The power in the pod was fluctuating. The energy levels were dipping, and not in a way that made sense. HFY? Nathan's voice was tight with alarm. What did you? She raised a hand, signaling him to be silent as the pod systems flickered. For a split second, he saw the faintest flicker of a smile on her lips. It was brief, too quick to fully interpret, but it left him with a sinking feeling in his gut. What did you do? Nathan demanded again, his grip tightening on the rifle. Her gaze met his, and for a moment the cold, calculated alien seemed almost amused. I did what I had to do, she said simply. We're not just fighting them. We're buying time. Time for you, human. The pod systems gave one final, loud, mechanical whine. Then everything went dark. Nathan's mind raced as the pod plunged into complete silence. He gripped the rifle tighter, his pulse thundering in his ears. His instincts screamed at him, warning him of the trap they were now in. But in the darkness of the pod, the weight of the situation hit him all at once. They were no longer in control. HFY had set them up, and now they were trapped. You set us up, he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and growing fury. HFY stood silently, her back against the wall. We're not done yet, human. Just trust me. This isn't over. But as the pod continued to free fall through the cold expanse of space, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been thrown into a game far more dangerous than he ever imagined. And now there was no way out. The silence in the escape pod was suffocating. Nathan's breath came in ragged gasps, the only sound breaking the stillness being the faint hum of the pod's failing systems. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led to this moment. The sudden attack, the treacherous escape, and now the growing realization that HFY had manipulated the situation from the start. He could feel the weight of her presence behind him, but he didn't turn to face her. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to demand answers, to confront her, but a part of him knew that confronting her at this moment would be futile. She wasn't afraid, not like he was. She was calm, almost eerily so. The dim emergency lighting flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pod's cramped interior. He gripped the rifle tightly in his hands, the weight of it a grim reminder of the battle they had just fought, and the one still ahead. What did you do? Nathan's voice was low but filled with restrained fury. What did you set up? Ishire's eyes glinted in the semi-darkness as she stepped forward. I made sure we had a chance to survive, human. It's the only way. Nathan clenched his fists. Survive? You're telling me this whole escape was part of your plan? Ishire tilted her head slightly as though amused by his reaction. You think I didn't know they'd catch us? She asked, her voice as cold as the space outside. The mercenaries? I knew they'd track us down. That's why I had you launch the escape pod early. You would have been useless without me. His stomach twisted. She was right, he had no idea what he was up against when it came to her. He had been blindly following her lead, hoping for a way out, but all along she'd been orchestrating their every move. You lied to me, he said, each word sharp, filled with the betrayal that burned through him. You could have told me the truth. I could have fought. I could have. I didn't lie, Ishire interrupted, her voice cutting through his rage like a blade. I only withheld the parts that were unnecessary. You would have been a liability in the fight with them. And there was no point in revealing my plans until I knew you could survive this. You're still alive, aren't you? Nathan gritted his teeth, her words hitting harder than any blow he had taken. He was alive, yes, but it felt like a hollow victory. He had been used, a pawn in someone else's game, and now he was trapped, with no idea how to escape this mess. I don't trust you, he muttered under his breath, lowering the rifle slightly, as if the weapon was the only thing between him and the anger bubbling inside. Ishire's expression softened just a little, but her eyes remained calculating, cold. You don't have to. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to fight. If you want to survive this, that's what we'll have to do. Nathan's eyes flicked over to the small control panel. The blinking red lights warned of the pod's failing systems, and he could feel the unstable energy surging beneath their feet, a constant reminder that time was running out. You said we had a chance, Nathan said, his voice tight. But if we don't get out of here? We will, Ishire cut in. But not by running. You're not a coward, human. You're a fighter. And I'm going to need that from you. A shiver ran down Nathan's spine. The way she said it, it was as though she was trying to remind him of who he was, as if the idea of him giving up had never even occurred to her. I don't have a choice, do I? He muttered bitterly. No. You don't? The pod shook again, a violent tremor that rattled the walls and sent both of them reeling. Nathan's stomach lurched as the sudden acceleration sent them plummeting toward a new, unknown destination. Ishire's hands flew to the control panel, her fingers moving swiftly across the malfunctioning screen. She didn't need to speak, her concentration told him everything he needed to know. The pod's communication system crackled to life again and Nathan tensed. This is your last warning, a distorted voice crackled through the static. Surrender. You are in our hands now. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. The voice, cold and impersonal, sent an icy shiver through his veins. They weren't playing around. They were going to finish what they had started. Ishire's hands froze on the controls for a brief moment. She looked over at Nathan, her expression unreadable. They think they've won, she said softly, her voice suddenly laced with something darker. But they don't know who they're dealing with? Nathan's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Ishire's lips curled into a small smile, her eyes never leaving the screen. They think we're just a pair of stranded survivors. But they've underestimated you, human. Before Nathan could respond, the pod lurched once more, the systems beeping as the emergency lights blinked in a rapid, erratic pattern. He grabbed the control panel to steady himself, his mind racing. What do you mean they've underestimated me? Ishire's smile faded, and for the first time, there was something almost sympathetic in her gaze. You've been trained for this, Nathan. You were prepared for moments like this? He blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. Prepared? What are you talking about? She stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. You're not just some cargo hauler. I knew who you were the moment I saw you. You're a soldier, just not the one you think you are. Your mind, your skills, they were honed long before we met. Nathan's pulse quickened, his head spinning as his thoughts scrambled to catch up. What are you saying? Ishire's eyes softened slightly, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her gaze. I was sent here to find you, Nathan. To bring you back. Nathan recoiled, his mind a swirl of disbelief. Back? Where? To where you came from, she said almost tenderly. To the people who made you what you are. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to process. Nathan's mind refused to accept what she was saying. He had been created for a purpose. He had known that, but the reality of it, the truth of it, was something far darker than he had ever imagined. "You're saying I'm not? I wasn't just born here?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You're telling me I was made?" Ishiray didn't flinch. "Exactly. And you've been running from your true purpose your entire life. But it's time to stop running." The truth settled like a stone in his gut. He wasn't just some ordinary human. He wasn't just a man caught in a random conflict. He was something more, something built for this very moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nathan whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Why keep this from me?" Ishiray's gaze softened again, though there was no warmth in it. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. And you still might not. But it doesn't matter now. The mercenaries won't stop until they have you. And neither will I." Nathan felt the weight of her words settle over him like a suffocating fog. He wasn't a soldier by choice. He was a weapon, a pawn, a tool to be used by forces far greater than anything he could ever comprehend. And Ishiray? She had known all along. As the pod continued its descent toward the mercenary ship, Nathan realized that the battle was far from over. But this time he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for answers. For the truth of who he was. And no matter how much he hated it, he knew now that his destiny had already been written. It was time to face the consequences. The pod descended rapidly toward the mercenary vessel, the cold vacuum of space stretching out beneath them. Nathan's heart raced as the familiar beeping of the pod's malfunctioning systems filled his ears. The emergency lights were flashing in time with his pounding heartbeat, casting an eerie red glow on the walls. The voice of the mercenaries, still crackling through the comms, continued to warn them to surrender. Ishiray stood beside him, her calmness a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. She had already sealed the hatch, locking them in for the descent, her fingers once again flying over the controls with unnerving precision. Nathan couldn't help but feel that even though they were on the edge of death, Ishiray was the only thing keeping him from falling into complete panic. "Get ready," she said quietly, her voice cold but firm. "They'll be boarding us any minute. And you're going to need every ounce of strength you've got." Nathan nodded, gripping the rifle tightly in his hands. There was no denying the gravity of the situation. The mercenaries weren't going to let them escape. He had to be ready for the fight of his life. But as much as he wanted to focus on the impending battle, his mind kept returning to what Ishiray had told him. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't even just a human. He was something else. Something manufactured. Something that had been created for a purpose he didn't yet understand. A tool. A weapon. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Ishiray glanced at him for a moment, the weight of her gaze making Nathan's insides twist. "I couldn't. Not until you were ready." "Ready for what?" he snapped. "To find out that I'm not even real? That I was made for some purpose, and that purpose is now catching up with me?" "Not just made for some purpose," she said, her voice a little softer now. "You were born for it. But that's a part of your past, not your future." Nathan's mind was reeling. Every part of him wanted to deny it, wanted to believe that he was just a regular person who had fallen into the wrong situation, who had been caught in a game far beyond his control. But the way Ishiray spoke, so calmly, so assured, made him think that maybe she was right. Maybe he had been running from the truth of who he was. Maybe he had been designed for this. The pod shuddered violently as it entered the mercenary ship's atmosphere, a series of jolts that left Nathan breathless. The docking clamps caught them, pulling the pod toward the larger ship with an inevitable force. The mercenaries were prepared for this. They were waiting. "We're here," Ishiray said, glancing over at Nathan one last time before moving toward the hatch. She pushed a few buttons on the control panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. The sound of metal clashing against metal filled the air as the pod was tethered to the mercenary vessel. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. This was it. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as Ishiray led the way, moving with a quiet confidence that made Nathan's nerves feel raw. The sound of boots on metal echoed in the small pod. Nathan adjusted the rifle in his hands, trying to steady himself. Ishiray was already heading down the narrow corridor of the mercenary ship, her back straight, her every movement deliberate. "Stay close," she muttered, barely loud enough for him to hear. "You don't want to get separated." They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows of the dimly lit corridors, careful not to alert the mercenaries to their presence. Nathan's mind was still reeling, and his steps felt unsteady. It wasn't just the impending battle that unnerved him, it was the sense of betrayal that gnawed at him. Ishiray had known who he really was all along. She had known what he was, why he was here, and she hadn't told him until now. But if he was truly designed for something greater, if he was created for a purpose, then what had that purpose been? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something more to this whole story. Something that HFY wasn't telling him. And then, without warning, the ship's intercom crackled to life, making both of them freeze. Target locked. Prepare for boarding, the voice growled, thick with the anticipation of violence. Here we go, HFY murmured, her eyes narrowing. She didn't even flinch, as if she had expected this. Nathan's pulse quickened as he followed her down the corridor, the sounds of boots now echoing through the halls, mercenaries closing in, moving to intercept. The air was thick with the tension of what was about to happen. HFY stopped abruptly, raising a hand in front of her. We'll split up. You take the right hallway. I'll take the left. Stay sharp. Nathan nodded, though every part of him wanted to protest. He didn't want to be alone, not with the mercenaries so close. But he had no choice. He had been trained for this, hadn't he? At least that's what she had said. He didn't know who or what had trained him, but he had to trust that whatever instincts had been instilled in him would kick in now. He turned, moving down the narrow hallway to the right as the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. The door ahead of him slid open with a hiss, revealing a small chamber filled with weapons. The sight of it made Nathan's stomach twist. This was it. This was the moment when his life would change, when everything would either fall into place or fall apart. He took a deep breath and stepped into the room, his rifle raised and ready. He wasn't alone for long. The first mercenary appeared around the corner, a hulking figure with a glowing plasma rifle aimed directly at Nathan. The sight of the weapon sent a spike of adrenaline through him. He had no choice but to act. His training, whether it was real or implanted, kicked in immediately. He moved like a shadow, stepping into the line of fire and firing his own rifle in one smooth motion. The mercenary's weapon sparked and he staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise. Nathan didn't wait for him to recover. With a swift kick, he knocked the mercenary to the ground, securing the rifle from his grasp. Stay down, Nathan muttered, his voice low and rough. The man groaned beneath him, but Nathan didn't pause. He couldn't afford to waste time. The silence that followed was only broken by the sounds of more footsteps approaching. Nathan wasn't alone in this fight, he knew that. HFY was already on the move, her presence a constant, reassuring force in the chaos. But as Nathan turned to face the next wave of mercenaries, a sinking feeling washed over him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for answers, for his own identity, for the truth of who and what he was. But every shot he fired, every mercenary he took down, only made him more certain of one thing. The truth was far darker than he could ever have imagined. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The battle raged on, the sounds of gunfire and explosions reverberating through the mercenary ship. Nathan's breath was ragged, each movement becoming more frantic as the realization of what was unfolding hit him like a physical blow. His mind had been whirling since HFY's revelation about who he truly was, but now, amidst the violence, the chaos, everything was coming to a head. The man who had once thought himself a simple, stranded survivor was something else entirely, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. HFY's presence was everywhere, a silent, assured force moving through the corridors with lethal grace. She was already clearing her own section of the ship, leaving bodies in her wake as she advanced. Nathan's heart thundered in his chest, his mind still grappling with the truth she had laid bare. But he couldn't dwell on it. Not now. His rifle was raised again, and he moved swiftly through the dimly lit hallways, every sense on high alert. The mercenaries were relentless, closing in from all sides, but he was faster, more precise than they anticipated. It was like something inside him had been awakened. The training, instinctual, unshakable, came naturally as if he had been prepared for moments like this for years. The ship's interior trembled under another blast, but Nathan barely noticed. He was focused, his mind operating at full capacity. He dodged, shot, and moved with an uncanny fluidity, clearing the ship's corridors as though this was second nature to him. The mercenaries didn't know it yet, but they were outclassed. But as the last of the attackers fell before him, Nathan's thoughts began to return to the most pressing question. Why? Why had he been made this way? Why had he been engineered for this purpose? He knew now that he wasn't just some cargo ship pilot who had fallen into the wrong place at the wrong time. He was something else, a weapon, a tool designed for destruction. A low hum filled the air, and the ship's comms crackled again, breaking Nathan's focus. This is Captain Solis of the Red Hawk mercenaries. You've made a mistake trying to take us down, the voice said, full of grim satisfaction. But it's not too late. Surrender and we'll make sure you have a quick death. Fight and we'll make sure you suffer. Nathan's jaw clenched and he tightened his grip on the rifle. He had been ready for this. He had been ready to die in this fight if necessary. But surrender was never an option. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the truth. He was fighting to reclaim the pieces of himself that had been stolen, to regain control of his destiny. I'm not going to surrender, he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Not to you, not to anyone. Ishire's voice came through the comms in his earpiece, steady and calm as always. We're nearing the core of the ship. The mercenaries are guarding something important. We need to stop them before they activate the ship's self-destruct system. Nathan's pulse quickened at the mention of the self-destruct. They couldn't afford that. Not now. They had already come too far. Understood, he replied, moving swiftly toward the ship's command center, his senses sharpened with each step. He knew what he had to do. But as he moved, the weight of the truth pressed against him. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a weapon designed for conflict, a living instrument of war, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his purpose, his very existence, was being manipulated by forces far beyond his control. Ishire was ahead of him when he reached the command center, standing at the entrance with a knowing look in her eyes. It's time, Nathan. Time to face who you are. Nathan swallowed hard but nodded. He could feel the moment of reckoning approaching, a moment when everything would be laid bare. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he had no choice. The door to the command center slid open and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with rows of blinking consoles and readouts. In the center of it all stood a massive screen, its display showing the countdown to the ship's self-destruct, a timer steadily ticking away. The mercenary captain, Solis, stood at the controls, a smug grin on his face as he watched them enter. I thought you two might show up, Solis said, his voice dripping with contempt. But you're too late. This ship's going down with you on it. Nathan's hand tightened on his rifle, but before he could move, Ishire stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. You don't have to do this, Captain. You've lost. Solis laughed darkly, tapping a few buttons on the console. Lost? You've got no idea what's going on here, lady. This isn't just about money. This is about power. The Red Hawk mercenaries were hired to stop something from happening. We were hired to stop you. Nathan's eyes narrowed. Stop me? He repeated, his heart racing. What the hell are you talking about? Solis turned to face him, his grin widening. You still don't get it, do you? You're not some random soldier, Nathan. You're the one they've been waiting for. The one they created. The one they want to control. The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He had known there was more to this, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. I don't, Nathan began, but Ishire interrupted, stepping in front of him, her eyes fierce. Enough, Captain, she said. He's not your weapon anymore. The mercenary captain's eyes flicked from Ishire to Nathan, his grin faltering. You don't know what you've done. The project. The experiments. Nathan was supposed to lead the next phase. He was supposed to destroy. Nathan's heart raced as the truth began to unravel in front of him. He wasn't just an accidental product of war. He had been engineered to be something else entirely. He was part of a larger, more terrifying plan. And the people who had created him, they had intended for him to lead an invasion. To destroy. No, Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't. You were built for this, Solis sneered. Your DNA was altered. Your mind was manipulated. Your memories were erased. You were made to be our weapon. And now you've just handed everything over to the enemy? The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Nathan's knees weakened. He wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't even fully human. He had been created for a singular purpose: destroy, conquer, and lead an army of destruction. And it had all been a lie. His entire life had been one long manipulation, a carefully crafted illusion to hide the truth. Stop him, Nathan, Ishire's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. She had moved and now she was facing Solis. You're not who they think you are. You never were. Nathan's hands shook as he raised his rifle. He didn't know what to believe anymore, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let these mercenaries win. Not now. Not ever. With a quick motion he fired, the blast hitting Solis square in the chest. The captain's eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the floor. The timer on the screen blinked, the countdown pausing for a brief moment as the ship shuddered. Ishire didn't waste any time. She moved to the control panel, working quickly to override the self-destruct sequence. The ship's lights flickered and the countdown stopped. It wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Nathan felt like he was in control. "Let's finish this," Ishirai said quietly, turning to him with a nod of respect. And Nathan, for the first time in his life, felt like he might just be ready to face the truth, and whatever came next. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.